I try to know as many of you as possible, so that I will talk to friends, not strangers. Dear friends, I'm an iOS developer, and since February, I'm building new features using SwiftUI and the composable architecture technologies. The composable architecture is not an Apple product, but it's really awesome, and I'll show you why. First, agility. I understand that as an ability to respond to a change. One, to be ready, needs a code in which it's very easy to find where the change should be taken. The change is done quickly and without some fear of risk that anything can be broken. That kind of code Martin Fowler calls an obvious. And I'm gonna make a slightly small change in an application and show you how these technologies helps me to build an obvious code. I'm gonna introduce you my minions. So first, okay, I have to stand here. Xcode. Xcode is an application in which I write the code, build it, test it, run it, see the previews. So it's everything in here. SwiftUI is a framework. It's a framework made by Apple. It's a declarative, so I just declare how the user interface should look like, and the rest is done by this framework. It's also responsible for updating the UI after some data changes. The composable architecture. Architecture is a set of libraries and guides that help me to build application. Actually, we're somehow forced to use new architecture in our application because SwiftUI is not compatible with our former architectures. Every single component in our application built with TCA, it's made of 4 parts, and I will tell more of those parts later. Requirements for my change are written in Gherkin. It's a language in which the executable specification is written, and I will run this specification using Cucumber. Some of you may not feel ready, but Napoleon says that over-preparation is the fall for inspiration. So let's start. Here we have an application. You see the list of accounts, and customer experience told us that people want to have somehow to see how much money they have. So we have to convert the visible amount to some default currency. Let's look into the specifications. We have here 2 scenarios. First one tells us that we need some kind of button to convert the amount, and this button should be visible only for accounts that are in a different currency. The second scenario tells us what will happen when we tap the button. So first one, when we tap it, the visible amount will be converted, and somehow it will look like differently. And when we tap the buttons for the second time, the amount and the appearance should go back to original one. So now we know what we have to do. So let's do that. Here we have a specification of a view for a single account. It's a specification written in SwiftUI. You see there are some texts and other views, and we're gonna add him here some button. I'm gonna leave the action part empty for now and add some prepared image. We see that something has happened. We see a button. I'd like to have this button bigger. I'm using font because actually it's a character, it's not an image. So I'm gonna use a slightly bigger. I like to have this button in our main accent color, and I need a style for this button just to it worked correctly. So we okay. The lines are too thick, so I like to have this line a little thinner. Yeah, it's okay. Now we're gonna see how this view is gonna look like on different devices. I can see the same view on a device that is in a dark mode, and it's in different device with small or large font, or even on a device where accessibility settings are turned on. Let me see. Just as I thought, this button is not especially visible on the dark mode, so I'm gonna better. So I'm gonna turn this on because energy is really expensive these days. We have a button. Now the button shouldn't be visible at all times, and we have to introduce some variables. Here we have a state. State is the first part of the component. It has all the data that component needs. The data that should be shown and the data that controls the appearance, like we need some default value. I'm not implementing it yet. You may wonder why I'm writing new variable for such a simple functionality. Let's dive into test scenario implementations. We have test scenarios, and which step should be implemented to machine know what should it do with this test step. In this step, we should check if the accounts list item that it's passed as a parameter to this test and its button visibility is the same as we expected. You see that implementation of this test scenario step is very easy, because I'm not diving into the whole user interface to found this button and check if it's visible or not. I'm just checking my logic. When I use it, it's the Swift UI who is responsible for doing this logic. I'm just responsible for setting this variable, and all is done by the framework. I don't have to test this framework, because it's using all around the world. Apple did it, tested, provided to developers. We need two more things, so just as our butter will be ready. First, fonts have to change, so we have to introduce some fonts that will change. And some that will have the original value, but at the beginning the value will be the same. Mistake. One more thing. We need to have a variable that remembers if we had already pushed the button. And we can use some default value. Let's use that. Let's go back to our view and use. Here we should use our visible funds, our new variable. And when the button is tapped, so that when the values are converted, I like to use italic font. And one more thing with the button, the same story. When the button is tapped for the first time, I'd like to change it some appearance. I've got some prepared image for this. Okay, data is ready. Now, when we tap the button, something should happen. So we're gonna go to the second part of our component, the actions. Actions is list of all things that can happen in our component, like some interactions with our interface, or when some asynchronous method is ready to give us the result, there is some action connected with it. And we're gonna introduce new action. Here's our new action, and that's all in here. We can use it. So when the button is tapped, we're gonna just send this action. And that's all. In the SwiftUI component, I'm defining the view and defining what values should be used in which part of the view, and what actions should be connected to the parts of the view that are making some actions. Where the actions are actually happen, the reducer is the third part of the component. It's the only part that can make some state changed. So we have a state of whole application, and only the reducers can change the state of it. It's really easy for developers to find where some change should be introduced, because it's here. If I have to make change in state of application, it's done here. Our new action. And so again, I'm leaving the implementation empty. And let's go and implement rest of the tests. I'll show you why in a second. So here is the test that checks if the converted view is changed. So the same way, the account that it's used in our scenario, and the value that this account should have. Here we have to use our new variable. And one more thing connected to the action with a button. So we just send the same action that we introduced for account that is in test, and our new. And now we can run the tests. Test failed successfully because we don't have any implementation yet, and so we had red in tests. Now we are doing the implementation. First, the button. It's very easy, actually. When the currency of our funds is different than default value, default currency, then the button should be visible. And here, values are converted already, and we tap the button. So it's the second time. We just go back with our value to the default one. And when the values are not converted and the button is tapped, so it's the first time, we need to convert our visible funds, and into that we need a fourth and last part of our module. The environment contains everything that our component is dependent of, but those are not part of our component. Like running asynchronous methods. It's not a part of our component to do that. Some A/B test flags that should tell us if some features are enabled for this user, and some algorithms that are common for entire application. So we're gonna just use this. And one more thing, just toggle our flag. And our logic is complete. Let's check it. Yeah, our logic is complete, and our binding of the view with the logic is complete. So now we can just look how our application is running right now. We have a button, and it works. So it's changing the amount that is visible. We've introduced a change to an application without really running this code on a device or a simulator. We know that it's correct because the test told us that our logic is correct, and the preview told us that the binding between the logic and the view is also correct. To summarize things up, we have a very short feedback cycle, especially while preparing the user interface. I could even make a conference call with some UX specialists, and we could do this view together. Some programmers will hate me for saying that. Next thing, you've seen that this architecture really helps me to separate things. Like user interface is completely separated from business logic. There are two separate modules, two separate files, and it's very easy for me to actually do that. For a developer, you've seen that it's very easy to separate the definition of the state in which application is and the code that mutates the state. There are two separate things. And the component logic is totally separated from the outside world. All the things that are outside are in the environment, and the environment can change, like test environment and production environment, and so on. Last thing, it was really easy for me to implement behavior tests to my logic, because there is a separation between logic and user interface, and then I don't have to test the user interface. That and other things, other features of this architecture helps me to reduce complexity, because we are dealing with complex problems, but our code should be obvious. And when I'm reducing complexity, I get code that is ready for some change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tomek. As always, we have more questions that we have time to ask, so please, if your question will not be read, please reach out to Tomek. Tomek, you are available, right?
Yeah.
You can catch him after this talk. And now let's try to squeeze in a question of two. Okay. So the question, one of the question is, so this is a very technical question, I guess, but one of the popular ones. If you are working with branches, how often do you merge code with this approach?
I think yesterday Craig said about continuous integration. How often? We are merging 3 to 4 days after each, more or less, some feature is done. Okay.
Okay, so if this person has more questions, please reach out to Tomek, maybe if you need any more details. Another one is, when you test user interface using Gherkin, do you see real business logic code or mock it? So what if the business logic is really complicated and has many cases?
We've made some feature this year. A single view in our application, the mobile application, had 172 test cases. And it was really awful. And I think that the design of this view was bad. It should be divided into some smaller ones. But we just get it ready, and we had to implement all those tests. So I'd prefer to divide things into some smaller ones.
Okay, and I guess last question, because we still have a little bit of time. So testing code variables will not guarantee that something will be visible for the user, because you may have a bug in the template. So yeah, how do you handle this with your approach?
That's why we use previews. We do some manual testing and some testing by developers and other set of tests and so on. When we are sure that the binding, the using of data was correct, then it shouldn't broke in the future. So we have to test it once.
Okay, so I hope this answers the question. Once again, if you need any details, Tomek is available. Please give him a big round of applause. Thank you, Tomek, so much for joining us in AgileByExample.